Welcome to the NEREJ NYREJ podcast. I'm your host, Rick Kaplan, and we have an interesting show today on rent control. And my guest today is Dave Barrett, and Dave is with the Institute of Real Estate Management. And we have Frank Flynn of Flynn Law Group, and everyone knows what's been going on with rent control in the city of Boston. And we want to try to discuss it today. And two people that might know the most about it right now is Dave and Frank. So why don't we start off with?
Well, Rick, I will never say that I know the most about any topic, but we are very familiar with this topic because it came up years ago, and problems. There were lots of problems regarding rent control, and so we're very familiar with the policy.
See, you can tell he's an attorney. We had to verify that for me. Well, I'm not going to say we're all experts on anything. You're right, Frank. But this is something we've all lived through it. I know I've lived through it in the 70s and 80s, and then it ended in the 90s, and it was horrible for the city. So now Mayor Wu would like to bring it back because it was so successful in the past, I guess. I'm not sure where she was living, but we all know how it didn't work.
I would say this. I understand the reasons behind it. I can understand Mayor Wu's reasons for sponsoring the ordinance and its passage with the city council. Rents are high, and rents, that is a concern for residents in the city of Boston. I think rent control, though, itself is not the remedy that's going to work best, because as Dave and I have been talking for the last number of months about it privately, it caused a loss of housing stock in the city of Boston. And we all saw landlords that would not maintain the buildings because their rent stayed at a low level and could not be raised, very hard to raise. And the procedures in place to bring any eviction cases were ponderous, slow, and difficult, and added a lot of expense to any case that a landlord would bring. And those are legitimate cases for criminal activity, non-payment of rent. It instituted a requirement that all of those cases had to go to City Hall, and just cause had to be shown in every one of those cases, which caused more expense for landlords and another procedural hurdle to bring a case in court. And these were legitimate cases.
Yeah. So there is a housing crisis in Boston, but it revolves more around the lack of inventory. And it's not economically sound policy to try to discourage developers from coming in when there's such a shortage of housing inventory, because certainly if the inventory increased, then prices would soften simply by a supply and demand type of scenario. The problem right now is that construction costs, with inflation in place, are enormously high. So developers are coming in, they're investing billions of dollars into these developments in the city. And, some of the advocates of this policy have gone on record to say, we don't care if they make a profit. Well, I think all of us in Boston need to care if people coming to the city investing billions of dollars are making a profit, because it's good for everybody in the city. Right now, new development is creating 6,000 jobs in construction, not to mention the jobs that are created through the supply chain. And many of our tenants work at these jobs. So by trying to help the situation, we could make it worse. You know, they had put some caveats in the proposal as far as like a 15-year grace period for new developments before it would affect them. But when you're investing billions of dollars, sometimes your hold period is longer than 15 years. And certainly to be told what you can do with the property after you own it, repositioning it, change, you know, having obstacles that they're putting in place to be able to change these into condominiums, is going to turn off investors that are spending that kind of money into the economy. Also, renovations came to a standstill during the last rent control initiative, and that right now is contributing about 915 million into the local economy, and that's creating 3,000 jobs. Not to mention the operating costs of these buildings, which are putting about 1.2 billion in taxes into the local economy, and that's creating, you know, another 6,000 jobs operating these buildings. So I think we got to be very careful about creating a solution that causes another problem, because if development slows, then people will lose their jobs, and these are our tenants that will be losing their jobs.
Well, you know, the whole proposal is, and Frank, you're right. I understand what her thinking is, you know, and rents are high, but they're at market value. You know, they're not any more than anywhere else in the country. You know, there's some places that are a little higher and there's some places that are a little lower. If you want to be in the city of Boston, this is what the market rate is. You can't put a Band-Aid on something like this. You have to come up with a real solution. And I think rent control is a Band-Aid, because down the road, we know it becomes a disaster. And what ends up happening is that, you know, landlords just don't have the interest in the city anymore. We have a world-class city, and the world-class city is having a lot of issues right now, you know, and we shouldn't be creating even more. And one of our big issues is our public transportation, you know, so you have that, and then you put rent control on. You know, these are things that I don't know what our government, our local government is thinking. You know, at this time, they have to come up with real solutions to keep companies in the city and have people that want to come back to live in the city. And rent control is just not it, because if you start having rundown properties, rundown areas, it's just going to move people out of the city.
Yeah, well, perhaps we should describe, you know, what we know from what happened the last time Boston had rent control. And the problems became very clear. Developers, because they had a cap on any profits and their properties were tied up in rent control, they no longer built properties for the most part, and that included affordable housing properties. And so if we're going to encourage development of housing in Boston, which is really the solution, as David says, the solution is tens of thousands of more housing units, whether condos or apartments. We need that housing currently. And when there's more and more housing developed in a city, then the prices come down. And so that's really the solution. When rent control was in place, the demand or the increase in housing just fell off the table. Properties, we just kept the units that we had. The population kept increasing, and it created this problem with lack of supply. And so it artificially capped any profits, and nobody would invest. So that was a big problem. The second problem were the procedures. Any case that had to go to court had to go through a whole procedure at City Hall with an office of good-meaning people trying to do all these cases, but having trouble scheduling them. And those were cases that, it added a couple months on an already slow process. And I have to say, right now, the courts are hugely burdened with tens of thousands of backlog cases. And so this rent control ordinance, if it passes by the House and is signed by the governor, will further impact upon a system where court cases are extremely slow, taking months. And these are legitimate cases where owners of property are owed tens of thousands of dollars of rent, or there's been criminal activity, or some other problem. And so, I'll stop, but I do want to talk about how landlords have been affected in the last 3 years. It's been so detrimental to landlords, and now this would be like the fourth hit that they would take.
Yeah, and I agree with Frank. We just went through an eviction moratorium for however long it was. Frank would know the time frame, but even now, evictions are very slow. When I sat through the hearings on this with the city council, the advocates would lead you to believe that evictions are happening left and right, and people are getting thrown out of their homes. And it's a major eviction crisis, and I just haven't really seen evictions, hand over fist going out of control here. In fact, many of us landlords have worked with our tenants to help them secure funding from other resources, and they really villainized landlords during these hearings and insinuated that we don't contribute to the community. And we do care. We care a lot about our tenants. Our tenants are our business. Without tenants, we don't have the income. And we care deeply about our tenants. We do a lot for our tenants, and we do a lot for the community. We have had members that have been on the Boston Police Foundation board. We've donated to the Boston Police Foundation. We donate to the Salvation Army, to Wounded Warriors, Diabetes Foundation, and we work with our tenants again and going through processes with different organizations to try to get them funding and to keep them in their housing, and we work out payment plans. So I do think that there are a small portion of tenants who may have been victimized by people that are maybe doubling their rent or so because they bought a property at a very high market, an existing property, not so much the developers coming in, and someone's been there for a long time and have artificially low rent, and that probably has occurred. But I will tell you, it's a very small percentage of landlords that would be doing that kind of thing. The statistics from CoStar pretty much show that over time, most landlords have been only raising their rents basically to meet inflation if you averaged it out. So I don't believe that this doubling of rent and throwing people on the street for no cause is as industry wide as they would lead you to believe. In fact, I don't really know anybody who's doing that type of activity. They also have suggested that many landlords have a policy of trying to get a tenant out after a year or two so they can jack the rents up every year or two. And that's certainly not the business model of any landlord that I've ever met or know of. And I've been in the industry a long time, and I think Frank can speak to this too. It's not sound policy to turn over a unit every year or 2 years and spend, $4,000 or $5,000 refreshing the unit, painting the unit, cleaning it, marketing it, losing a couple of months of rent. So all of this stuff sounds good for the advocates who are pushing these measures, but I don't believe it reflects the market at large. I think it reflects a very small percentage of landlords out there.
Well, and that brings up a good point, Dave, because you have in this market, you have all kinds of help for people that need some kind of a housing. You have affordable housing, you have Section 8, you have there's 20 million different names for what we're talking about. The state has vouchers, that they can give to tenants, all due to your income status. And so when, they say rent control, do we really need an additional thing to put in place when you have all these other things in place? If a landlord has people that are, the rent goes up like 50-60%, which that's probably very small cases. It might have gone up a couple $100 as opposed to thousands of dollars, so if the person was in there and they're just scraping by, hey, that might be a problem, but that's really not what's going on here. The problem that we're talking about is the affordable housing.
Right. So, Rick, I think you're right. And Dave, I also would agree from what we see that there are many programs helping residents of lower income levels, certainly. And the federal government, the state has lots of subsidies, vouchers. There's the RAF program. City of Boston has rent monies to assist residents, and we see all of that helping residents, and we agree with all of that. That's all great work. I think that's very helpful to residents. I think the problem here is this goes to a step where it's going to impact on the amount of housing that's going to be created. In speaking with one of the city council persons last week, that person indicated that they were already getting information and word from developers and large companies that would ordinarily be seeking to invest and produce more housing. They were hearing that, if rent control passes, that they were already staying away from the city. Those development dollars would go to other cities and towns, perhaps Hartford or in Rhode Island and Providence or up to Portland, Maine. We work in all of those states, but we'd really like to see that Boston develop as much housing as possible. And so having a rent cap or rent control is really going to impact the amount of housing that's created. And so, I did want to talk just a little bit about how much landlords and owners of affordable housing have been impacted over the last several years. Well, 3 years ago, when COVID started, there was a federal government eviction moratorium, and that restricted any cases with regards to non-payment of rent. And that went on for about a year. And then there was further moratoriums by the state, also by the city. And basically it was about 2 years that landlords could not bring cases for non-payment of rent. And that has severely distressed properties. We see it still with properties that are owed hundreds of thousands of dollars. And those monies are still owed, despite all the programs, all the RAFT monies, the SHIRA monies, all of those programs. There are still hundreds of thousands of dollars owed on those, large affordable housing properties. And now, when you have about a 2-year moratorium on non-payment evictions, then what happens is once the moratorium is over, the courts had a backlog of cases. Now more cases are filed because there are residents that owe $5,000, $10,000, $15,000. And this might become as a surprise to the general public, but we see many, many, many of these situations. And so affordable housing properties still are experiencing these problems, and they are exacerbated and will be exacerbated by further caps or controls on developing new housing.
Actually, I was talking to a landlord that he was telling me about one tenant that owes them $30,000, about 30,000. And the solution, the tenant's solution from, when they're asked to pay back, is that they move out of the place and find another place. They think that they're never going to have to pay that.
We've seen that over the last several years. We've seen that quite a bit. We had a case. This was during the eviction moratorium, it was a house, and it was in a well-to-do suburb. Rent was about $5,000 a month. The tenants didn't pay. It was a 5-bedroom house, beautiful property. Rent got up to about $70,000, and then they just all moved out. And the landlord didn't recover any of it.
No,
so
people don't care.
Well, these are situations that they're not publicized. But that's an example that we had. We have other ones that weren't probably as drastic as that, but this was like a luxury property. And I understand at the time, the regulations, we understood that we were going through a pandemic. And the programs were supposed to help, but it required tenants to apply for monies. Landlords were able to get share monies. That was excellent, very helpful. But then once the landlord got the share monies, a landlord could not bring a case for 6 months. And what happened was there were tenants that just didn't pay the rent for the next 6 months. And so, landlords have been through so much in the last 3 years, and affordable housing properties especially have been really impacted. Now, if we put in a rent cap and housing dries up, new housing dries up, then we'll be in a worse situation. And it'll be like it was back when we had rent control before. Properties were not maintained because no more money could be obtained out of the property, and some properties were underwater. Those were foreclosed upon. We had no new development of housing, and properties in very bad shape. I heard one estimate that the city of Boston lost like 20,000 units of housing during the last rent control. I'm not sure where that figure comes from. So I think there's other ways. How about incentives to development companies to build housing? I know some things are being done, but it seems like that's where all the emphasis should go. That's where the dollar should go. Banks also, they're going to kind of, investment companies will steer clear. If they hear about a rent cap, they aren't necessarily going to want their money tied up in a property for 30 years if there's a rent cap. So even the discussion of it has a chilling effect on investment in housing in cities where rent control is being discussed.
And that's so true, because I got a call the other day from a developer that had plans to build 100+ units in the city, already had the land, everything. Now he wants to just sell the land. He's not going to go through with the build or develop that 100+ units.
Yeah.
So, and that's all due because of the talk of this rent control.
Dave mentioned construction costs, and I think construction costs in the city of Boston are very high. We all know the supply side difficulties and the increase in costs of construction materials and the increase in wages for the good people that build the housing. All of those costs make it even harder for a developer to afford to build in the city of Boston. And, you know, we need to lower those costs and add incentives and help fund affordable housing. That's really where all the efforts and should go. We don't see landlords trying to increase the rents in very high amounts. We just don't see that.
Yeah.
So, you know, I'd love to see a lot more funding to build more housing. And so so developers aren't scared away, as in your example, Rick.
Yeah, and the other thing, I saw some data that said we need to be building 3,000 apartments a year just to keep up with the demand, and that's not adding, you know, more inventory to soften the prices. That's just to keep up. The developers that are building these properties also have to set aside a percentage of the units as low income, affordable housing. So when they go in, they're creating some of this affordable housing when they're building these developments. So yeah, with what Frank said all the way is, you know, I think we all acknowledge there's an issue with housing in Boston. We just have a totally different philosophy on how it should be handled. And certainly vilifying and punishing landlords and owners is not going to solve the problem in a long-term nature, and certainly it's not economically wise, because when these properties go in, you know, the property taxes and all of these jobs that are created running these buildings, building these buildings, is all very healthy for the city of Boston, and it's all very healthy for our tenants. You know, I know there's a bunch of constituents out there that have had bad experiences, and there's a lot of push to get this rent control pushed through, but it's really not a long-term economically sound policy from our standpoint.
Yeah, and I did want to say, with regards to the procedural requirements for cases where a resident does owe rent or there's been criminal activity, in those cases, this ordinance imposes a new level, another place where the landlord has to first go to prove just cause. I would say that the courts, you know, the courts look at the cases, the judges look at the cases. If there isn't just cause to bring a case, then the court will throw it out. Attorneys for the tenants will file a motion. But, you know, if there's no monies owed, then there wouldn't be just cause. So I don't understand, you know, why there needs to be another level of scrutiny before it goes to court. There's housing courts where, you know, judges have been doing this for a long time, and they can tell if there's a good cause to evict. And so, and there are lawyers that will bring motions to dismiss where there isn't good cause to evict, and it'll all be overseen by a judge. Instituting another place that landlords have to go to prove good cause just adds expense and delay when the landlord has to still prove good cause in court. And we don't see cases where there aren't good cause, monies are owed, or there was a shooting or a stabbing or some terrible criminal activity, and the landlord would want to get to court as soon as possible in those criminal activity cases. And if they have to go to City Hall first to have a preliminary hearing there and wait for those procedures, it used to take several months at least. And that would add, already it takes 3, 4, 5 months, 6 months. A jury trial case, it'll take even longer in court. So now we're adding, you know, 2 or 3 more months onto that process. landlords that are currently owed hundreds of thousands of dollars in rent, they may not make it. They may not make it through. And so that's our concern with another part of the ordinance.
Well, you mentioned a perfect thing was the criminal activity. Now you have trouble getting this criminal activity out of your property. It doesn't just affect that one property. Now it affects the whole neighborhoods. And now it's going to ruin, not just one apartment. It's going to ruin that property that you own. It's going to ruin all the homes that are surrounding that property. And the city of Boston, now the crime rates go up. You can't stop them.
Exactly, Rick. And another thing is that when you go to prove just cause or good cause on the case, you have to do it with witnesses. So you'll have to have a hearing, at the City of Boston office and show that there was criminal activity. That means subpoenaing police officers. That means having residents that witnessed the criminal activity come to City Hall to testify. And it's difficult to get witnesses to come to court to testify about something that they saw, some criminal activity or a shooting. Getting those same witnesses to come to two proceedings, not only a just cause hearing at the City of Boston, but then a trial at the housing court. That's doubly difficult, and residents may be concerned that they're sitting in the hallway with the person who committed the criminal act, that they're not going to want to be seen. So some cases will fail because witnesses will not want to go to the just cause hearing at the City of Boston. And I recall having to have witnesses come to City Hall. I don't think they could just go on like a police report. That doesn't seem appropriate. They would have to have some kind of hearing, and so that engenders all kinds of difficulties and concerns.
It's very sad because now you have all the shootings that you see some of these neighborhoods that the ministers and the reverends they're up in arms because the community's up in arms. They want something to be done about that. And they're asking the mayor to do something about that, and putting something like this in place doesn't help that situation. It's going to make that situation even worse.
Yes, I can see all the problems with having that extra level, and at a time where there are shootings and there are gangs, and we deal with these cases all day long. Having witnesses testify is a big hurdle. So these are concerns, very strong concerns that I know that affordable housing owners and management companies have, and that we have, and that we bring these cases and seek to prosecute cases against crime and bad actions. I've been doing this for 35 years, and last time we had rent control, it went terribly. It did not work well. It basically accomplished destruction of housing. Properties were not maintained. The city had to have more enforcement mechanism because buildings were not being maintained. I know there were many more inspectional services cases, and probably more staff would have to be hired because buildings won't be maintained, and that's another issue that could occur.
So we just talked about that's a big part of this whole thing, and I'm looking at why aren't more of these community leaders stepping up? You know, they should be the ones that should be saying to the mayor, no, we don't want that rent control. We don't want to have that issue. We finally get to a point where some of these areas have been beautified. You know, they're really nice. And now we want to put the rent control and put a stop to all that. Yeah, that's crazy.
Yeah, I think if you look back at the condition of the city in the 80s, and you look at it today, where a lot of the neighborhoods have been improved, and a lot of the bad neighborhoods, let's say, for lack of another term, have been pushed out of the city and cleaned up. And the city's really a beautiful city. A lot of people that visit the city compliment to me how beautiful it is. You know, how much open area there is, you know, that's been created. And, you know, we hate to take a step backwards. Oftentimes, well-intended legislation has negative side effects. And this is one of those pieces of legislation that is well-intended. It's intended to protect the tenants, but it's going to have a lot of negative side effects that I don't believe have been thought through to the extent that they should be. As you say, dealing with the crime, dealing with the development, the inventory, the economy, and, you know, with inflation, and we're just coming out of the pandemic, and the economy's still a little bit fragile, to add something else that could affect jobs in Boston and development in Boston is just not a good idea at this point in time. Probably it feels like a good time to do it because there's a lot of construction in the city and things are going really well, but and they don't think it's going to have that type of effect because things are going so well in the city, but it very well could, and probably will have at least a cooling off of development in the city.
Yeah. So two things. Dave, you mentioned that things are going well in the city, but I don't think the public knows or city council really realizes that for housing and affordable housing, things are not going so well. There are hundreds of thousands of dollars owed
Right.
to properties that properties may never see because residents may just move. And that $10,000 balance, which we see very frequently, will just not get paid. Furthermore, the second thing you mentioned is new development. And new development throughout the city has really made the city a beautiful place. You'll notice that a lot of those properties have a significant amount of affordable housing. We do a lot of commercial loans and things, and we see that there are units that are set aside for affordable housing, which is, that's a great thing. And so you'll see public infrastructure where developers have been required to rebuild subway stations, train stations, and that's a great thing too. As part of the deal, I know that developers have to supply funds and sometimes construct new portions of the train station or the subway station. I'm sorry, I don't know exactly what to call it, but you see it all over the city. Beautiful places where it used to be a dump, right in was it Alston Brighton, right on the Mass Pike. There is a subway station or commuter rail that there's housing nearby, and there's a new commuter rail kind of stop for the public. And this has happened all throughout the city. What a great partnership. Developers come in, build more housing, help develop the infrastructure, the subway stop, the commuter rail. And as part of that, they're able to build housing. And also the city gets affordable units as part of that. That's historically been the way in the last, I don't know, 20, 30 years that the city has redeveloped vast portions of the city. So that's a great thing. It's just that this rent cap will dry up investment in the city of Boston, from what I hear and from what one of the city council persons told me they were already hearing. So that's a scary thought and doesn't bode well for the next 20 years.
And
No, and I was going to mention that, I've been to a lot of these hearings when developers are developing a new property, whether it be commercial or residential, and the city or town, whichever one it's being developed in, will ask the developer, can you improve X amount of feet of the road? Can you add some parking because the residents in that neighborhood don't have a lot of parking? So developers often do a little extra to the infrastructure, as you mentioned, to get these developments built. So it's a little disheartening when you listen to these hearings and you hear over and over again about how developers and landlords do not contribute to the community. And I strongly believe that's a false and misleading statement from my experience.
well, the landlord, the big bad landlords, they think the landlords they're sitting on mounds of gold bullions, in their house. It's just the way people they vision that as a landlord. It's not that case. Yeah, they worked hard to develop what they have. And, there's nothing wrong with someone working hard and building up a business to get to that point. That's the way America was built. Obviously the country is changing. We're trying to figure out how to make it so people can stay home all day long and get a check and don't have to work hard, but in the same thought, they are thinking, well, I want to stay home, but I want to get the same ability that the big bad landlord has. So how do we even this out? Well, they have to figure out how we balance what they get from their income levels, and I think the income levels really something that should be reevaluated in this whole thing.
Well, I think the income, the average income has gone up considerably, at least from my experience, especially in and around the Boston area. Certainly, we're paying our employees a lot more. I think Frank can attest to that. Anyone owning a business, there was a lot of rhetoric at these hearings that wages have been flat. Well, I don't know anywhere over the last year coming out of the pandemic with the labor shortage the way it is, and that's all over the news. It's not something we're making up, that people are getting paid more. People have switched jobs to more appealing jobs. There's a lot of job opportunities out there now. So I don't think it's fair to say, oh, wages have been flat and, everyone's jacking up the rent, because I don't believe that to be the case either. I do believe people should make a fair wage for their work. Certainly, we need more workers in the workforce, and we'd welcome more people to come to the workforce to work for us because we need them. But I do think wages have gone up pretty considerably in the city, even for the average worker and the blue-collar worker and the lower-end workers, as well as the executives. So that has happened to some extent, and I would ask Frank to comment on that. Do you agree with that?
Well, Dave, I'm certainly not an economist, and Rick, I can't really comment on, whether people want to work from home or not, but certainly in the if individuals want to work from home, that's fine. It does appear that wages have increased, consistently across the board. Perhaps it's a reflection of, the increased costs. The pandemic, a lot of factories were closed, and, there was still demand for goods and food and products. And certainly the invasion of Ukraine has impacted the food supply further. And so, wages have gone up, it seems, and the cost of living has gone up too. It's just that with regards to this topic, I just we want to see more housing built, more affordable housing built, and we need those 3,000 units a year. And I think it's important that the incentives be in the right place, not a disincentive to developers of affordable housing and housing in general, and a disincentive to banks and investment companies to invest, because after 15 years under the ordinance, then they will be restricted. And all these loans they're longer than that, and these are big deals. And so that means that the developers are taking more of a risk, a lot more of a risk, because if the rents are capped 15 years later, the loan monies are still there, need to be paid. And if the property's facing increased labor costs, increased maintenance costs, increased supply costs, all of those costs get factored into the budget. And that those monies will still have to be paid in the future along with the loan. And so the incentives should be to encourage development, and certainly this bill does not do it. We've seen it in the past. Back when rent control was in place, a lot of dilapidated properties, no increase in housing, a decrease in housing, and it was just not very good a time back then for the city, and that's why it was voted out, and that's why it clearly failed.
Well, we have lots of information we still have to go through on this. We're running a little short on time, but one of the things I couldn't find, is there an income verification for this rent control?
I don't believe so.
I didn't see one. You mean like an income verification for like the resident?
No.
Well, the way it's structured, it's the landlord would have to show non-payment of rent to be able to go forward with an eviction, which means a hearing probably at City Hall like they used to do way back 30 years ago. But it doesn't, there's no sort of income verification of the
Right. So
resident.
someone making $200,000 a year goes into an apartment like this. What would give them the incentive to ever move out of that?
Well, yes. I mean, certainly we've all seen, that when somebody has a rent control apartment, of course, they want to stay in it. And
Right.
yes, their income could go way up. I remember there were some famous stories of individuals that made millions of dollars, but still kept their rent control apartment because they only had to pay like $500 a month.
Right.
And some examples came out of some celebrities or famous people, or I remember that.
So, the three of us are just talking here, and we kind of solved the solution. And that was that instead of putting in rent control, focus on what we have to do on the existing programs we have, like the affordable housing program. Maybe that needs to be reevaluated. Look at maybe we give a little more money, subsidized money for that, change the income levels, and figure out if someone makes an income of this, then we only give them this much.
Rick, you're absolutely right. So the state has a budget, a certain amount of money for affordable housing, for subsidies. During the pandemic, those were all increased. All of those monies could be increased to provide for additional subsidies, vouchers, monies for development of housing. Hundreds of millions of dollars could be put toward those areas. I know the city of Boston has a housing initiative. Monies have been put into that. That's great. I don't know all the specifics of that program. But the more money to build housing, the more housing stock we will have. And if we suddenly had 10,000 units built next year in the city of Boston, that would certainly impact the supply and decrease the price, which would be the rent. If the 20,000 units were built, then that would further lower the price of the rent. And so it's basic economics, and I think that's really the solution. I think developers and affordable housing property owners and management companies should be applauded. During the last 3 years, they have taken tremendous efforts to help residents file for RAFT monies, for SHIRA monies. They have implemented eviction prevention programs. They have done really everything they can to stabilize housing already. And it's just very hard for them to now have additional restrictions, additional regulations that are going to really impact their bottom line. And unfortunately, we really need that affordable housing. We need those management companies. We need those real estate companies. And another negative impact is going to hurt them. And when we could lose companies, we could lose housing. And we all remember when the federal government had to take back tons of properties because banks failed. We just recently had 2 banks fail. So are we going to have the, what was it called? It was a government agency that took back all these properties, and that certainly didn't help housing. These properties were foreclosed upon, and residents all had to move out. These were hundreds of units. Was it REO or something like that? It was government agencies were set up to take back all of these properties. And that wasn't that long ago.
Yeah. Well, like I said, we were coming short of time, but I hope someone from the city of Boston has been listening to this, because we have some great ideas here, and like we're talking about, they can focus on the right things, and it could be a win-win for the landlords, the tenants, and the local government, because they all get what they're looking for. Instead of putting something new in place that is going to probably work in a negative way for the city. Well, actually, for everyone involved. So,
Right.
Dave, you have any last words you want to put in?
No, again, it's all about inventory and the jobs and the economy. And that's what's going to help the city of Boston, and that's what's going to help our tenants, is having those good jobs, having people come to the city and invest billions of dollars into housing, improving the neighborhoods as they have been. And that's really, in my view, the way forward through this, and certainly not what's being proposed right now.
And Frank, you have any last words to add to this?
No, I think we've portrayed some of the pitfalls and negative impacts of a rent cap. And I agree, with David, your comments, and Rick, with regards to increasing the housing stock, the amount of apartments, condos, developments. We need a lot more housing, not more restrictions. So more housing, less regulation. Let's put funding in the right place, which is supporting the development of more housing for the citizens of Boston. And I think that will lower rents and accomplish the goals of this ordinance. But going about it this way, with more restrictions on already impacted landlords and development companies and real estate companies, that will really hurt the tenants, because They will not get more housing. They will not get better maintenance. And in the end, it will lower our housing stock, and rents will go up because we won't have as many units. So, I feel for our clients, the real estate companies, and I support strongly, assisting residents and tenants with monies to assist with the rent. But procedures that will, slow or stop court cases with criminal activity, that's not going to help neighborhoods.
A lot of great information, a lot of good ideas. This is something that should go on all the time, where people have these open discussions, and maybe we get solutions, real solutions, instead of let's put something else out there, put Band-Aids on everything. That doesn't solve anything. I'd like to thank our guest today, Dave Barrett, Legislative Chair for the Institute of Real Estate Management, and Frank Flynn from Flynn Law Group. And if you have any questions for either of our guests or for myself, you can reach me at rkaplan@nerej.com. Until next time, have a pleasant day.